Hey guys, welcome back to Vertical Momentum. Yes, I'm wearing a mask. I don't want to hear you vaxxers or any complaining about anything. It's my show and I'll do what I want. Sorry, somebody got the cooties in my house and I don't want it. But guys, this is going to be an interesting conversation. This is Kauffman Squared. You got two of us, two Kauffmans on the same call. We're going to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, resiliency, and we're going to be talking about recovery. Um, I grew up an abused child, not in sexual ways, but in other ways. And it needs to be talked about because a lot of people are abused and they're suffering in silence. And we don't want them suffering in silence anymore because, that just ends to suicide. And we don't want that. So Jake, my brother, and he got a brand new book out, an amazing book. We're going to talk about that too. But Jake, welcome to the show, brother. How are you doing today?
Richard, I'm doing fantastic, sir. Thank you again for having me.
Oh, it's my honor, and especially like I said, when me and my wife, when we were going to have our last child, if it was a boy, we were going to name him Jacob. So, and so
Love it.
you have a place in my heart already. So let me ask you a question before I forget. What is your definition of resiliency?
I think my definition of resiliency would be nothing to prove and nothing to protect.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, it takes a powerful person, a powerful man, to transform his pain into purpose or his pain into progress. Until we do that egoically, our false self, our admired identity, or whatever it is that you want to call it, is going to have something to prove and something to protect because it has yet to reconcile the pain from the past, which means what do we inevitably end up doing? We recycle it into the present. And so it takes a really powerful, resilient person, a really powerful, resilient man to dive into his pain and to ultimately die to this egoic persona that we take on in response to pain.
Yeah, and I love that, and I love that pain to purpose. And for me, I say make your mess your message. And that's
Sure.
that's how I've overcome and
Yep.
make my mess my message. But tell us, give us a little bit of background. Where'd you come from? Where'd you grow up? And
Yep.
then we'll get into the deeper the heart stuff. So tell us a little bit about you.
Love it. Well, I grew up in Southwest Michigan in a really small town of 1,000 people. Same town, same school, same church. So grew up in a very isolated environment with a very loving family. Um, and not to get ahead of myself or get ahead of you, but ended up experiencing sexual abuse right around the time I was 12 or 13, which, as you can imagine, served to form the basis of my identity and my belief system moving forward.
Okay, and like I said, I've had a couple people. My friend Adam Davis, he was just on. He was abused by at 5 years old. And another friend of mine, Paul, he was abused by a priest at age 12, and
Sure.
never came out until it came out on this show. And now he's helping other
Mm.
people deal with this. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about what you were like before the abuse.
Mhm. I was I was a very open child, very curious, very enthusiastic, and in many ways I remained that way. However, it my personality became this amalgamation of genuine characteristics and also adaptive traits that were in response to the pain that I experienced so that I could ensure that it would never happen again and that I would never experience that pain again. So I really just doubled down on those things. And it went from being like a genuine, natural, authentic expression of who I really am to posturing, proving, and seeking to position myself above other people. That was really just a self protective strategy.
All right. So now like I said, we just met and we finally got together and chat. But when I was growing up and I was being abused, for
Yeah.
me, my solace was books.
Sure.
I've, I've, like I said, I'm a ninth grade dropout, but I've read over 6,000 books. I have,
Wow.
I got 15 going now at one time. But that's where I ran to. That was my solace. Now,
Yep.
you very well read, obviously by the words that you use. So, talk to us. You know, what was your solace during these times?
Sports was a huge solace for me. Absolutely, because I turned to performance as a way to outrun my pain. Like you mentioned, you turned to books, which is a great avoidance strategy. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with books or sports for that matter. It's all about the underlying unconscious motivation beneath the conscious behavior where reality, where we find reality. And the reality for me is that I turn to performance, I turn to sports, I turn to academics. So the pursuit of power, possession, and prestige, if you will, in order to, like I mentioned earlier, just posture and prove and position myself above others, better than others, because I was in so much pain.
All right, now like I have my friend. Her name is Annette Wittenberger. She has a podcast called "A Wild Ride Called Life." She was abused as a little girl, and
Mm,
she would tell us how when she was younger, she was a gregarious, outgoing,
yep,
loved to be hugged, loved to be touched. After the abuse, didn't want to be touched so much, didn't want to be
sure.
a lot of people. So if somebody's listening to this and they see that their child was once outgoing and now
Yep,
they're really quiet, or they were really
mm,
quiet and now they're just out of control,
yep,
talk to us a little bit about some signs that we can possibly look for in our own children. Because I got 3 children, so for
yep,
me, anything I can always do to become a better father, I'm all about.
sure. Well, I think the thing that's going to be the biggest red flag, if you will, is overcompensating strategies. So if they're not their normal self, and I realize it's very fluid when we're talking about young kids because they absolutely evolve and change and take on different personality traits as they grow older. That's very normal. But if you have a severe departure from your normal everyday experience of that child and there's this consistent overcompensating happening, it is very, very likely in response to some relatively significant pain. And I think the thing that's very important to talk about and establish when it comes to pain or trauma is it's much less about what actually happened and much, much more about how we internalize it. So something outwardly traumatic may not have happened, like big T trauma, assault, abuse, or like an extreme accident. It may more have been emotional trauma, neglect, abandonment, things like that, validation that when internalized causes the child to develop this fundamental lack of self-esteem or healthy ego structure that gives them the confidence that all kids arguably need to know that like I can do it and I have what it takes. So any overcompensating strategy that is a severe departure from their normal personality.
All right, so then I have a question because I have an 11-year-old girl, I got a 19-year-old son, and a 21,
Sure.
going to be 21-year-old son. And I've talked to a lot of parents about the same issue, and a
Hmm.
lot of them would be like, well, my kid is 12 years old. They're old enough; they don't have to worry about this. So, talk to us about how everything transpired at 12 and 13 years old. Have you ever had people say, "Well, you could have just walked away or told somebody"?
Um, well, I'm glad that I'm glad that you brought that up. Um, and because I was actually sleeping when my abuse occurred. So it actually happened at Christian summer camp. and I was in a cabin with all of the friends that I grew up with. Again, same town, same church, same school growing up, and an older camper who was probably a senior in high school. So I would have been in what, sixth or seventh grade ish, and he would have been a senior, so he's significantly older than I am. He crawled in my bed and essentially assaulted me, and none of my friends actually tried to stop it. So there were multiple different facets, if you will, to this trauma, which there is to most trauma. There's what was going on beforehand, what actually happened, what was going on around you when it happened, and then, of course, what happened after the fact. And so there were a lot of different layers for me. There was what happened, the assault itself, but then there was also the fact that none of my friends tried to intervene and stop it from happening. And so there was a lot of betrayal. There was a fracture of trust, and there was very much this feeling that, okay, if I these men, these young boys who I've been friends with my entire life, many of them I don't remember not knowing. If I love these guys as friends, and they can allow this to happen to me, love isn't safe. And this was never like a conscious belief that I chose. It was more so how I started to show up in relationship when it came to how I interacted with friends, with family, with romantic partners in the future. I would start to perform. So I would only go to a certain depth or degree in that relationship where I would allow the person to see me. At some point in time in the relationship, a certain level of connection felt incredibly unsafe. And it basically rang these alarm bells that said, hey, you can get hurt here if you go any deeper. So it basically created this barrier between me and love and connection and intimacy.
Okay, so what was it like the next day? Because, and I believe when somebody experiences trauma, their
Yep.
life changes in a moment.
Sure.
Like 9/11, I'm not the same person I was at 9/08 that I was
Yep.
at 7 that morning. I was changed in an instant.
Yep.
So when you woke up that morning, if you slept at all, you were not the
Mhm.
same kid. So what was that next day like, and the rest of the time at the camp?
So I'll be honest, I don't really remember. Because while I agree with you inherently, practically speaking, in a lot of instances like this, people completely
Yeah,
disassociate.
yeah.
And so, in many ways, I dissociated and I didn't acknowledge the event for what it was because it was kind of treated as this joke, as this practical joke that clearly went way far beyond anything that is remotely appropriate. And so I kind of treated it as a joke myself. And as a result, I was able to suppress it. So it wasn't until I was 27, 28 years old where I started to notice these patterns, like I mentioned, that continued to come up in relationship where I would only let people in to a certain degree. I would hold people at arm's length, which of course prevented depth of connection in any of my relationships with friends, with family, with romantic partners. And so I started going to therapy to try to figure out what was going on, what was driving that behavior. And it wasn't until in therapy where I started unpacking my past with my therapist that I acknowledged the event for what it was. Like, oh, that was abuse. So it took me 15 years before I really dealt with it. So I do agree with you, theoretically speaking, that we're never really the same, but consciously, I never actually thought about that because I dissociated, because I actively and unconsciously worked so hard to suppress what had happened and the emotions that came with it, the shame, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the anger, right? I worked so hard to suppress it and essentially turned to sports and academics in order to distract myself from that. And it created this persona, this character that wasn't actually me. It was just in response to pain. And that's why I often tell my clients, my coaching clients, that oftentimes our greatest strength is really an adaptation or an overcompensation to avoid experiencing pain.
And I agree. Now, also, you know, knowing that these guys, your friends,
Yep.
you know, they didn't have your back. They didn't look up for you.
Yep.
You know, did was there a point where eventually? Because for me, I would have been like, you know what? No, I don't. I try not to curse on the show, but it's my
Sure.
it's my show. I can do what the hell I want.
Yeah.
In my mind, I'd be like, you know what? Fuck you guys.
Totally.
You didn't have my back when I needed you. I
Yep.
don't need your friendship, and
Sure.
that would affected all my relationship up to a point because now I
Yep.
don't trust anybody.
Totally. Yeah. I think for me, it was a little complicated insofar that I grew up in a town of 1,000 people. So it wasn't like I could be like, fuck you guys, I'm going to go make some other friends.
Yeah.
It was like, these are your friends, because this is before cell phones. This is 25 years ago now. And so at the time, I didn't really have a choice. And friendships were very important to me. So because of the dissociation that occurred, and how actively I and unconsciously I worked to suppress the pain from that incident, I was kind of able to go back to normal, even though I very much started overcompensating after that in order to remove myself from the pain and protect myself from like full feeling the full weight of that pain. So in many ways, I did go back to those old friends, but you are right. There was this fundamental fracture in trust that I could count on these guys in the future, and I never truly felt like I fit in with them after that.
All right. So now also, I've talked to a lot of people that have been abused, like me and others,
Sure.
and especially to deal with sexual abuse.
Mhm.
When it happens at such an early age, your views on sex not it totally changes. Like
Sure.
my friend Adam said, how do you expect me to have a healthy relationship with sex when I've gone through that trauma? And a lot of us will act out. A lot of us will start watching stuff we're not supposed to watch, sleeping around with everybody that we can sleep around with.
Sure.
So how did that get skewed? As you were coming of age.
I think the biggest thing that it skewed for me, at least early on, was my sexual identity because it happened in front of a lot of my friends and because we lived in such a small town. Everyone knew about it relatively quickly, at least within my peer group. And so people started calling me a faggot. People started saying that I liked dick in my mouth. And so as a 12 or 13-year-old, you start to hear that and you don't have the mental resources because you're in the process of establishing a sexual identity and sexual attraction. You're kind of like you're left to be confused. And you're like, well, do I? What does this event say about me? Like, am I gay? Like, I don't even really how do I know? And growing up in a religious environment, that wasn't really talked about. It was kind of swept under the carpet because religion doesn't really know what to do with people's natural sexual impulses that we all experience when we start coming into adolescence. And so what do? They just make them wrong, you know, and they don't really talk about them. And so for me, I was kind of left to figure that out on my own. And thankfully, I did, and now I have a beautiful girlfriend who I have a beautiful relationship with. But for a time being, it was very confusing around like what does that event say about me? What does it say about like my sexuality or my sexual preferences, my sexual identity? And so I was kind of left to, unfortunately, sort that out on my own, um, you know, as I was growing up. But I imagine for some people, it leaves a lot of deep wounding and scars in a way that can cause them to respond or react in a different way than I did.
All right, so I want to dig a little bit deeper in there, but
Sure.
I want to thank our sponsors. As you guys know, without my sponsors, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. Guys, if you love, I love knives, and this knives was actually sent to me by my friend Mike from down below. He was actually on the show Forged in Fire, and he makes hand carved, handmade knives, just for you. Not actually hand makes them all hand carved. So if you guys like knives, something that maybe for Father's Day or something you want to get for your dad or for yourself, check it out down below at Mike's Damascus Knives. Also, guys, as you know, a lot of companies are getting breached big time. And if you're a small company and you don't want your um, computers to be taken over for ransomware, like Dallas just got hit big time, $10 million for ransomware. My friend Daniel at Indy's IT department takes care of all of our computers, all of our phones, to make sure that we're bugger free and virus free. So why not let somebody protect you that raised their hand to protect this country? If he'll protect this country, just think what he'll do for your company. So if you guys are looking to make sure your phones and your computers are virus free, write virus down below and I'll get that information to you. All right, Jake. So let me ask you a question now. My come to Jesus moment was 9:08 on September 11th, 2001.
Okay.
What was your moment where you said, you know what? I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I need to get help. I need to straighten this shit out, or else I'm going to be 60 still dealing with the same stuff from when I was 12. What was that moment?
That's a good question. It would probably be in March of 2015, so a little over 8 years ago now. As I mentioned, I got to this point where I saw that I was sabotaging in relationship. I was holding people at arm's length. I would only allow them into a certain degree before love, before connection and intimacy felt safe. And I started to self sabotage, which is just to say, another way to say that is to say I started to self protect and I started to push away those people. I started to sabotage those relationships. And so in March of 2015 was when I made the decision to get help, I guess you could say. Um, but I basically signed up for a personal development program because that was really the only thing that I knew um, what to do at that time. Now, I had acknowledged a couple years prior that the incident that I experienced, I acknowledged it as sexual abuse. But after that, I totally ran away from it. I was like, oh, got it. And then I stopped going to therapy because I was just like, I don't really want to go there. I shined a light and I was like, I'm good. Don't really want to deal with that. Um, and it was 2 years later, pretty much around the same time, that I decided, all right, you know what? I need to work on this. I need to make an investment in myself, in my healing, so that I don't continue to carry this around, so that I don't continue to recycle the pain from the past in the present moment. And that's when I went into personal development as a student initially. And it's what set me on the path to what I'm doing today.
All right. So, as like I said, I was talking to Adam last week, and he had a thing. It was called his blue room, because
Sure.
that's where all the abuse happened, in the blue room. And he said eventually he had to open up the door, sweep out the blue room, and painted the color that he wanted.
Yep.
So, sometimes I think that we have to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Then we got to work towards cleaning the wreckage of our past. And for me,
Yep.
I teach a 12-week course on the 3 pillars of forgiveness.
Mm.
First of all, we know
Powerful.
hurt people hurt people.
Yep.
Um, you know, I know I've hurt a lot of people, and obviously, and I've been in recovery now for 34 years. So I had to go back and ask the people that I hurt for forgiveness. And then I had to forgive people that hurt me, because I realized that, hurt people hurt people. And then the hardest person to forgive is ourselves.
Mm.
So talk about forgiveness and how that's helped you along your journey.
Oh man. It is ironic, isn't it, that forgiveness in many ways is the ultimate hit to the ego. I do believe that in many ways forgiveness is not about the other person, it's about us. It's about us releasing any pain, resentment, anger, bitterness, frustration, because as long as we continue to hold on to those emotions are going to hold us back. Every emotion has a frequency, an energetic frequency attached to it. If you're familiar with like the emotions chart, love being the highest, shame and guilt being the lowest. And so if you're carrying around and harboring these unprocessed, repressed emotions, and you're not actively working to release them, transmute them, move beyond them, whatever you want to say, then you're going to start to embody the energy attached to all of those emotions. Like there's a lot of science that goes into this.
Yeah.
Um, if you're familiar with Joe Dispenza's work, he talks extensively about this
Yeah.
and how that creates dis-ease in the body, which eventually creates disease and starts to manifest as physical symptoms. And so forgiveness is essential. It's absolutely essential in order for us to not just let love in, which is why I titled the book what I did, but open ourselves up to a greater degree of abundance, financial abundance, opportunity, relationships that are really going to serve us, challenge us, and propel us forward in our lives. If we continue to harbor those emotions, those lower vibrational emotions, we are going to attract things that are associated with them. So we're gonna attract people who are in a victim mentality, right? Because they're holding on to guilt, shame, anger, bitterness, resentment, right? So we're gonna start to attract people that embody the same frequency and think similarly. And of course, that's going to hold us back from achieving our goals, moving forward in life, and achieving our mission or whatever your vision is.
All right. So then, because you're a pretty young guy, I'm an old fart. But the person that hurt me, the people that hurt me, they're still alive. Some of them are alive, some of them are dead. I had to forgive the ones that are alive, and I actually wrote letters to the ones that aren't here anymore and burned them. So,
Sure.
uh,
Powerful.
the person that abused you, is he still around today? Did you forgive him? And
Hmm.
also, how does a person, if somebody abused them and they're not around anymore,
Hmm.
how can they find some peace with forgiving them? Writing a letter, or what is your thought process on that?
I think that's a really great way, whether or not the person is still living or is not living. Because to suggest that someone should contact their abuser, I'm never going to do that. And the reason for that being is because the process of doing that can actually, in and of itself, be traumatic for the person, depending on what they experienced. And every experience is different. And so, if someone feels called to do that, feels called to contact the person and have a conversation, and they feel safe to do that, great. But for me, when it comes to coaching people through this process, I'm always going to encourage them to do what feels safe to them and still allows them to accomplish what they're looking to accomplish. So I think writing a letter and saying everything that you need to say, getting it all out on paper, and then burning it is a great way to do that. You can also work with a therapist, which is what I did, to do what's called regression work, where you actually relive
Hmm.
the incident through hypnosis or meditation, and it allows you to safely, constructively, with the help of a clinician in this case, process through the emotions attached to the experience. And the minute that you're able to separate those two things, and I talk a lot about this in my book, the minute that you're able to separate experience from emotion, that's when you're able to essentially move on and step into, say, forgiveness for the other person, for yourself, and you're really able to find some peace. So I think writing a letter is a great way to do it. I think regression work with a therapist is another great way to do it. If you feel safe enough to have a conversation with that person, and that is appropriate, I would encourage that as well. But I always leave that up to the individual. I also think you can do catharsis work, which is, if you're holding on to these emotions, anger, bitterness, resentment, um, getting a pillow and like literally screaming out those emotions, right? Because if we don't transmute it, right, we embody it. And so I think those are probably the best ways that I would recommend.
All right. So now, but like, say somebody like you,
Yep.
you come from a town, 1,000 people, and
Sure.
if you don't move out, which a lot of people, they move out away from problems, but they don't realize that you take you with you wherever you go.
Of
So you're,
course.
so how, when whether it's a family member sitting across from the table with you at Christmas, or somebody that you run into in the mall that abused you, how do you deal with those emotions at that moment?
Well, if you are actively doing this healing work that we're talking about right now, because that's what forgiveness is, right? You're in the active process, you're an active participant in your own healing. At a certain point in time, there isn't going to be any emotion attached to that experience. So I think that's a long-term answer, is that eventually, with enough commitment and consistency, you're going to move beyond this in a way to where you no longer self-identify with that experience anymore, or the identity that you created, however consciously or unconsciously, on the back end of it. But in those moments, if you haven't achieved a certain level of healing, because obviously healing exists on a spectrum like most things, and you run into that person and you're triggered, be with the trigger. Most of us want to run away from it, avoid it, and suppress it. And we do this in a variety of different ways through a variety of different coping mechanisms: drinking, drugs, pornography, but also being obsessed with work and success, or working out, health and fitness, having an unhealthy relationship with food. So we eat our emotions, we eat our feelings. Be with the trigger, because if you're with the trigger long enough, especially if you shift or change your environment, eventually it's going to go away. The biggest question that you get to answer in that moment is, how much of this can I do and still feel safe? How much can I engage with these emotions in a way that feels safe to me to process my way through them? If you run into a person that abused you at a mall, you don't have a lot of control over that. You have to remove yourself from the situation, and you have to sort of self-regulate, right? Because what I'm fundamentally talking about is self-regulation, is allowing those emotions to process through you without reacting to them. This is the definition of emotional intelligence: experiencing emotions. So let's just say you actually run into the person that abused you. I'm assuming you're going to experience a wide array of emotions: anger, bitterness, resentment, all the things that we've been talking about in the past. That's not the problem. That would be very normal, right? Even if you have done a lot of healing. However, what you do have control over is whether or not you respond and react from the space of those emotions. Between stimulus and response is a space. In that space is my power to choose.
And because I'm just thinking about when I met my abusers, and because I met my father, left when I was 3, and I'm like, man, when I'm an older, I'm going to beat his ass, and
Sure.
none of it happened. I
Right.
became like a little blubbery little boy, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But now, as time's passed and he's gone, all the forgiveness, and I realize that people hurt people, and
Yeah.
and then a lot of times we don't realize, like, we can't, we don't forget that they abused us, but we can forgive. And then a lot of times when we look back in their past, we find out that they've been abused. So it's
Totally.
just a cycle that just keeps, and we're the ones that have to end the cycle abuse. So now,
Absolutely.
all right. So now let me ask you a question, because if I pick up a book, I don't pick up a book just to read. I pick up a book to learn something. Um,
Sure.
if I'm watching a movie, if I'm watching cartoons, I'm looking for life lessons, and no matter what I do.
Yeah.
So when you get your book, Why did you write it, first of all? And
Hmm.
because obviously, if you guys think writing a book you're going to make a lot of money, you're going to be rich, wrong answer. You're probably going to spend more money than you make. So what was your writing process, and
Yeah,
was it cathartic for you to write the book?
it was very cathartic for me to write the book because, a little backstory, I started down my healing journey when I was in I would have been about 29 years old. I'm 37 now. So this would have been in 2015. 4 years later, I had done a lot of work on myself, had come a very, very long way in terms of my healing and personal development and my forgiveness. And I felt comfortable to share my story of sexual abuse because now I had started my coaching business and I worked with a lot of people. Come to find out, a lot of these people had very similar experiences to me, especially the men. They had just never told anyone. So I got to this point within myself and my healing where I felt comfortable to be able to share my story on social media. So I posted about my sexual abuse on social media, and the amount of responses I got was overwhelming from people who I didn't even know who read my post because it was public and reached out to me privately, connected with me, and told me about their abuse and what they had suffered and what they had gone through, and how healing it was to know that they were not alone in their pain. That, because of course that's probably the biggest lie, right? Is that we're alone in our pain, that nobody knows what we've gone through. And even though every situation has its own unique circumstances, at the end of the day, it's much more about how we internalize that pain and how it affected us, that everyone has in common. The limiting beliefs, the stories, the meaning that we give it that ends up holding us back later in life and prevents us from experiencing the full spectrum of love, abundance, and joy that life has to offer. And because of that, I was inspired to write a book because I was like, I think I can help a lot of people. I think by sharing my story and the steps that I took to work through my pain and heal from my abuse, I think a ton of people can benefit from this because I have so many people reaching out to me, so many people connecting with me, telling me how my post, just one post on social media, how deeply it impacted and affected them. And I was like, well, if people are this impacted by a post where I didn't actually offer any steps that people could take, it was just me sharing my story, what could happen if I were to write a book and actually walk people through the steps that I took, the journey that I took to ultimately turn that pain into progress, into purpose, to be able to support men in the way that I do today. Like you mentioned, less than 1% of men ever report their abuse. And this is what has men performing. And what I mean by that, it typically, in most instances, has men operating at two opposite ends of the spectrum. One is passivity and avoidance, right? So men playing video games, they're watching porn, they're addicted to their coping mechanisms. And the other end of the spectrum is this hyper masculine approach where men are just pushing, pushing, pushing in an unconscious attempt to claim victory over their pain. And what is in both instances, it's the same song, different dance. Both men, they're doing the same thing, but they're not connected to their true and authentic self, their heart's calling, their mission, their purpose in life and for living. And it's what has them anxious, depressed, and committing suicide.
And I totally agree. And this whole notion of, because guys say, I hear it all the time, just man up. No,
Terrible advice.
that's what's killing men.
Correct.
That's what's killing guys. Instead of, like, when I moved here from South Carolina 12 years ago, I had no friends. I only knew my wife, and I was so closed off until I decided, you know what? In order to me to have a friend, I have to be a friend,
There you
and I
go.
have to be vulnerable. And
Hmm.
like Ed Milet put out a great post, I shared it today, about vulnerability. You know, guys, we should be able to, like, I got a 12-year-old daughter, I got a 21-year-old son, and a 19-year-old son. They all get hugs, they all get kisses. I tell them I love them. I'll apologize to them if I do something wrong. I'll cry in front of them because that's what men should be. We don't have to be these macho assholes that just walk around all bowed up, because we're actually hiding something. So
Totally.
talk to us about why, the whole man up mentality is killing men daily.
Because it is fueling this high performer persona that really is an unconscious attempt to outrun their pain or perform their way around their pain. It's an adaptation, it's an overcompensation. It has men overcompensating. Well, if you're overcompensating, that's going to create a pressure cooker because what are you inherently doing? You are fundamentally suppressing and denying the less than ideal qualities and characteristics about yourself, including the painful things that have happened to you. So what do you do as a result? Naturally, you posture, position the ideal qualities about yourself. This creates a pressure cooker, and most men are living inside of this pressure cooker. If you live inside of a pressure cooker, you're going to need a coping mechanism. A coping mechanism, by definition, is an avoidance strategy. So, what I find in my work with men is most men are addicted. It's just a question of what are they addicted to. Right? It's very easy to demonize drugs, pornography, and alcohol, but a lot of men are addicted to other noble coping mechanisms, such as work and success, which is it's much easier to justify because it's justified behind the guise of having a hard work ethic, caring and providing for the family, or establishing a lasting legacy. Other men are obsessed with their health and fitness or their diet and their nutrition, and they justify it behind the guise of being health conscious or being incredibly active. It's the shadow intention, the unconscious motivation beneath the conscious external behavior. It's not a matter of asking, what do I want, but why do I want it? That is reality. The unconscious motivation is reality. There's nothing inherently wrong with working. Of course, you should be a hard worker and provide for your family. There's nothing wrong with being health conscious. Of course, you should exercise and work out. We know that there's tons of benefits to doing that in terms of longevity, in terms of energy, in terms of your mental health and how it can support your mental health. But so many men are using these things as unconscious coping strategies or unconscious avoidance strategies so that they don't have to deal with their pain.
All right. So now, because this is a teaching podcast, if somebody's out there listening to right now, because I actually, as we're talking, I'm sitting there going, yeah, that sounds like me. Yeah, been there, done that. Yep, still doing that. So
Sure.
talk to us. If somebody's out there listening to this right
Mhm.
now, what are some of the beginning steps to healing?
Every hero needs a guide. At the end of the day, the goal of the ego, the false self, the number one goal is to maintain the status quo. How does it do that? It hides the truth from you. I say that to say we all have blind spots. Where do you think our ego puts our pain so that we don't have to deal with it? In our blind spots. So a lot of us are completely unaware of how the pain from the past is showing up for us in the present moment. It's not until we start to work with a therapist, a coach, or a guide that can actually objectively analyze the results that we repeatedly and continually create in our lives and pinpoint what that's associated to or what that is attributed to. Most of the time, if you haven't done a lot of this work, or if you don't have a baseline for this work, I almost guarantee that a significant amount of your behavior is ultimately in response to pain or the avoidance of potential pain, the possibility of pain. So until we work with someone who is capable of pointing out our blind spots and illuminating the unconscious motivation that lies beneath every conscious decision or behavior that we have, we're just going to continue to repeat the same behaviors, take the same actions, make the same decisions. Carl Jung once said, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will continue to direct your life and you will call it fate. So you have to work with someone who is capable of pointing these things out to you, because your ego is working so hard and so actively to hide them from you.
So then how would your book benefit us?
It provides you with a blueprint for healing, pure, plain, and simple. It has you analyze your results, because your results paint a perfect picture of what is actually going on beneath the surface. The pattern always reveals the problem. And so the book, in many ways, yes, it's about my story and how I worked through and overcame my pain, but it also provides you with a blueprint for how to do the same in your life.
So now, last question is, how do we find the book? Where do we pick it up? And also, how do we support your ongoing mission?
I appreciate the question. Thank you so much. The best way to contact me is, or connect with me, is on Instagram. My handle is I am Jake Kauffman. However, Kauffman is spelled Kauff, two F's, MAN. So I am Jake Kauffman on Instagram. Otherwise, you can go to my website, awakewithjake.com, and you can pick up the book on Amazon. It's called Let Love In, and you'll have to use my full name to search for the author. So Jacob Kauffman, again, that's Kauffman.
All right. So, brother, I just want to say thank you so much. I think this really needs to be talked about, because, we're losing up to 50 to 55 first responders a day. We're 5,000 adolescents are attempting suicide every day in the United States. So
Terrible.
this really needs to be talked about. And I just want to say thank you so much for you being so open and honest and letting people know that it's okay not to be okay, and you're not alone in the fight.
Amen. Thank you again, Richard, for having me.
And guys, like I said, my tagline, I'm a big Joel Osteen guy, and he always talks about how you can choose to be the victim or the victor. Guys, please choose to be the victor and no longer being the victim. Jake, brother, thank you so much, and have an amazing week.
Thanks again, Richard. It's been a great conversation.
God bless you. And guys, I will check you out later. And remember, vertical momentum, the only way to go is but up. I love you guys. Jake, have an amazing week, brother.
You too, Richard.